I think, well, if I can have your attention, we've now come to the last session of this conference. After such a long and varied conference, it takes a very brave person to try to sum up. So what we've done here is to have two people to sum up and then someone to sum up the summing up. My name is David Katz, and I'm head of the history department in this university for another 87 days. And the first speaker that we have today is Alain Dieckhoff from CNRS, whose field of research, as you probably know, is politics and society in Israel. He's the author of, among many books, The Invention of a Nation, Zionist Thought in the Making of Modern Israel, which came out in 2003. And his latest book is entitled Revisiting Nationalism, Theories and Processes, which is coming out with Columbia University Press. It came out with Columbia University Press last year. Hello.
First, I want to thank Moti and Epi and Rajan for being behind this conference, which was, I think, very stimulating when we had a lot of very interesting presentation. And all those presentations gave us, I think, a lot of things to think about. Of course, it's always a very difficult task to speak and to try to summarize the main ideas which were put forward during those almost 3 days. So what I would try to do is to just set some main topics and themes which were brought during the various presentations, and offer my reading of what I think was most interesting in what was said. The first thing is that I would like to disentangle some key concepts which were more or less present during these days. The first one, which was not very used by the various during the various presentations, and I think in a way it was better that it was not too much mentioned, is the concept of nation as such, not nation as nation. Because with nation, to use Ernest Renan's very well-known question, what is a nation? Answering this question has given rise to a huge amount of theoretical literature, but in the end, finding empirical characteristic in order to get a generic definition of the nation has generally proven disappointing. Isolating the nation's putative contents, political bond, language, religion, common history, sense of belonging, is, I think, in the end, a futile exercise. Because nation is not an objective category, but a subjective one. Belonging to a nation is the product of self-awareness. And that's the reason why I think that as a concept, it's not quite useful, because you can struggle years, days and days about the question, are the Palestinian nations, are the Turkmen a nation, and so on and so on. But the question is not to have an answer to that, but just to see if people are mobilizing, and if they believe that they are a nation. That's the main point. So I think that the concept of nation is not important, but the concept of nationalism is much more important. And what is nationalism? I think that nationalism, and we saw during a lot of presentations which were presented here, it's both an ideology and it's also a political movement which mobilizes a group defined in national terms. And from the point of view, I think that Gellner's view is really at the heart of the matter. Gellner states that nationalism, I quote, nationalism is primarily a political principle which holds that the political and the national shouldn't be congruent. So, the political in the age of nation-state has to be at the same time the national. And that's what nationalism is about. And for me this is a very important point when I come to the question of ethnicity. Because nationalism is an ideology of political legitimacy linked with the advent of the state as the legal supreme organization. That means clearly that there is no nationalism before the age of the nation-state. And from that point of view, I think that definitely nationalism is a modern phenomenon. It is a modern phenomenon. It is also, and I think we had some glimpse about that during several presentations. It's also a trans-ideological movement. It is neither on the left nor on the right of the political spectrum, but on both sides, as it can be mixed both with socialist ingredients or with conservative features. And that's precisely why it is so powerful. I come to the third concept I want to speak about, which is also in the title, ethnicity. I think that while nationalism is basically political, ethnicity is not. Ethnicity is basically a social and symbolic relationship between agents who see themselves as culturally distinctive from members of other groups with whom they are in interaction. Ethnicity might be politicized, but it's only a possibility, while nationalism is political through and through. And I think this is really a basic analytical distinction. But this analytical distinction doesn't mean that it is necessarily a sociological one. Ethnicity is often, and we had a lot of cases during those days, is often a valuable basis for nationalism, because it helps to draw boundaries with the others. A shared ethnicity makes it easier to foster nationalist mobilization. Of course, you have some examples in mind. The example of Israel is, of course, one of the examples, but not the only one. You have the Irish, for instance. You can look at some peoples in Central and Eastern Europe. But this doesn't mean, for me at least, that I think that there is a linear continuity between ethnies and nations, precisely because nationalism brings the state in. That's the breaking line, because there is a link with a state. And one of the consequences, and I'm thinking, for instance, about the presentation yesterday on Dagestan. In fact, we see that many ethnic groups do not demand command over a specific state. But national groups always express demand to this effect, or at least ask for political autonomy within an existing state. This leads me to try to make a separation between two patterns of cultural diversity. One is polyethnicity, and the other is multinationality. I borrow, in fact, this dichotomy from Will Kimlicka. But I will give to this dichotomy a different meaning. What is polyethnicity? I think there are two forms of polyethnicity. One which was only marginally tackled in this almost 3 days, and I would say wisely, because it's a form of polyethnicity which is not connected with nationalism, or only marginally. While the other second form of polyethnicity I will speak about may be connected with nationalism. So let me start with the first kind of polyethnicity, which was present in I would say two or three presentations. This is the polyethnicity which you can call linked with new ethnicity. I mean by that the ethnicity rising from migration, recent migration, mainly from non-European immigrants in Europe or in the US, or also, by the way, ethnicity linked in states who are basically based on immigration. In that kind of setting, I think that in this kind of states with this kind of new, what I call a new ethnicity, nationalism is not there. It's not an important factor. I think that for this kind of groups, mainly immigrant groups, for instance, what is needed is, I would say, a patriotism of gathering, which will lead them to be included in the state in which they went. It doesn't mean, of course, that the state in which they are going has to assimilate them. There is a possibility for these groups to preserve a specific culture. But the main objective of the state is nevertheless to ease their integration. And to do that, the measures has to be mainly fighting against any form of discrimination, racial and religious, while implementing temporarily preferential treatments in order to equal opportunity, in order that, that equal opportunity is more respected. We can think, for instance, about all ways of affirmative action and so on. But what is really quite obvious for me for this kind of new ethnicities, nationalism is not an option for them. I mean by that, nationalism understood as the quest of political and territorial autonomy within the state where they have dwelt. Of course, you can have nationalist mobilization, but it is done on behalf of the country of origin. They support, for instance, the state from which they come. For instance, Algeria, for the Algerians in France, or the Turks in Germany. Or maybe also they support the secessionist nationalism, for instance, the Kurds or the Sikhs fighting for a state of their own. But they have no nationalist option in the country where they have settled. And here there is a difference with the second form of polyethnicity I mentioned, which I haven't found maybe the good term to define this kind of ethnicity, but I would say it's a more kind of traditional ethnicity. I mean by that, ethnicity linked with the coexistence of different ethnic groups within the same polity. And here I'm thinking mainly about what was often called plural societies in Africa or Indonesia, mainly in post-colonial state. In this kind of states, nationalism is an option. It's not always present, and this is also important. In several presentations, we saw clearly that you have some states where ethnic groups can coexist peacefully, or even if they don't coexist peacefully, nevertheless, they don't ask for a breaking up of the state in which they are. For ethnic groups in this kind of plural society, many cases they do not challenge the existing state. They just demand a better representation within the state government, and they accept the political order in which they are set. But in some cases, when they think that the rules of the game are asymmetrical in a way, they may go towards in the direction of nationalism. Of course, we can think about what happened in Nigeria in the end of the 60s, with the Biafra, the secession of Biafra, and this kind of examples where ethnic groups, in fact, go in the direction of nationalism and mobilize along nationalist lines. Let me go to the second main distinction I wanted to stress, which is what I called, borrowing's Kim Lik-Kar's name, multinationality. So let me just add that the ethnic groups, the settled ethnic groups in a way, are, in my view, interesting because they are fringe groups, groups which are in fact between one and the other category. They can switch from one to the other. Multinationality. What is multinationality? I think multinationality is mainly the situation where you have an incorporation of groups, mainly involuntary, by conquest or transfer from one imperial power to the other, and an integration in a state. And the Hungarian, for instance, which we spoke about, Slovakia, are a good example of that. And you have a lot of other groups of that kind. And these groups can be either national minorities, like the Hungarian we spoke just about, or can also be nations, what I call at least nations without states. I'm thinking here about, for instance, the Catalans in Spain, or the Scots in Great Britain. These national groups are global societies. I mean by that societies with a comprehensive social structuring, political institutions, a specific political space, a territory, and a specific societal culture. That is, a culture which provides its members with meaningful ways of life across the full range of human activities. Of course, to give you here some example, which weren't raised during this conference, but which could have been, the Quebec cases, for me, is clearly one of those cases. Let me go to the way of managing those differences within the states. To accommodate national groups, the first condition for me, and it was raised here and there during the discussion mainly, or also the presentation, is of course equal citizenship to everybody. This is of course the basic premises. Individual citizenship to everybody. But of course, in a lot of circumstances, it is not enough. Those groups should also get some self-government rights, some form of political autonomy or territorial jurisdiction. And what kind of jurisdiction? I think we had several examples which give us some idea of what could be done. Consociationalism, in the case of Belgium, for instance, can be one of this kind of arrangement. What does it mean? Mainly, it means, or Lebanon, was also a case of consociationalism, even if it collapsed finally. It's based mainly on segmental autonomy granted to the constitutive groups. And in some cases, the autonomy can even be non-territorial. It's not necessarily a territorially based autonomy. And the second principle, second feature, is a power-sharing mechanism between the elites of each subculture. And going sometimes with consociational agreements, but always in other cases independent of that, is of course federalism. Federalism is a very classic mechanism for recognizing self-government rights. And I think it's not by chance that it has been adopted by multinational states like Belgium, Spain, and Canada. Of course, we one thing here is very important. We saw that with with yesterday's presentation concerning Russia. This federalism has to be a democratic federalism, not an authoritarian one, of course. And that's the reason why federalism, which was put in place in the USSR or in Yugoslavia during the Titist area or in Czechoslovakia, was, of course, a flawed federalism, because it was an authoritarian federalism, which in fact meant nothing in reality, in practices. So federalism can work, but it has to be linked with a democratic setting. What I would like to look at now, because it was something which came out in several presentations, what are the conditions for this kind of arrangement I just mentioned, like federalism or consociational agreements? I think that one conclusion I draw for what I heard is it is better to have crossing cleavages than overlapping cleavages. What I mean by crossing cleavages is it's better to have more than two groups, if possible, and it's better if there is no, for instance, connection between ethnicity and social inequality. If you have an ethno-class, it's much more difficult to make this kind of arrangement work. And from that point of view, I think that the presentation on India was interesting. Of course, there is a main cleavages between Muslims and Hindus. But I think that behind that, it's important to see that the highly linguistic and social diversity of India makes it very difficult, in fact, for groups to go in the direction of secessionism. Even for the Muslims, in fact, because they are spread all over India. And for Switzerland, for instance, it's also an interesting case, because I think that one of the reasons Switzerland still exists is that if you are French, you can be both Catholic or Protestant. Of course, not the same person, but I mean, you can speak French and be either Catholic or a Protestant. And the same is true for the Germans. You have Germans Catholics and Germans Protestants. I think this is a good starting point if you have this kind of crossing cleavages to help those institutional arrangement working. The other case is that of overlapping cleavages. I think that Sri Lanka, for instance, or Belgium are cases where you have only two groups, even if you have some minor groups, but two main groups, in fact, and where the cleavages overlap. And here it's potentially much more dangerous, and the risk of breakup of those states is much more high. What makes accommodation collapse? For what I heard, I think that there are mainly two big main reasons. The one is a very important one, and this is especially important, I think, in order to go against primordialism. The first is the internal context. Even if you have identities, it is not enough. Those identities have to be mobilized, otherwise nothing will happen. What is internal context? I think the Yugoslavian case is very interesting from that point of view. I think that one of the reasons why nationalism grew in the 90s is, of course, the consequences of a series of factors which were mentioned yesterday. But let me just tell about some. The demise of constitutional order. You are always undoing the constitution, trying to accommodate, but in the end, it has very perverse effect. You have economic equality, and you have, of course, a very assertive policy of one of the players at the time, Milosevic. When you have this kind of, I don't imply by what I just said that you cannot have other factors. I just mentioned some of them, which were also mentioned here. When you have this kind of situation, with an unequal distribution of power, then nationalism can become very easily a mobilizing force. And here also to go against primordialism is very important, and we saw in different cases the role of the elites. I don't mean by that that the elites are creating all things, but they are very tough and very good in using nationalism in order to foster their own interest. And I think that Yugoslavia, from that point of view, is also very interesting, because you say that you see that the elites were in fact eager to keep their power by using in fact nationalist rhetoric and practices, and moving from communist leaders to nationalist leaders. So the internal context is always a discriminant factor to explain this, the collapse of accommodation, and in sometimes, of course, the upsurge of violence. And the second is also the external environment. And still here, Yugoslavia seems to me an interesting case, because the end of the bipolar world, the end of the division of Europe, was, of course, in the background, and was a main element which made it possible for those elites to assert nationalism and to use nationalism in order to foster their interest. But I must also imply one thing, and I think it went up in several presentations. Violence is not necessarily linked, I would say, structurally with nationalism. You can have some even breakup of states which will go on peacefully. Czechoslovakia is one of the examples. This means also that I remember. This reminds me one of the one remark of the later Ernest Gellner, who said, "You should not only care about the dogs who barks, but also about the dogs the dogs who don't." I mean, he meant by that you should also look at the cases where, in fact, things went smoothly without violence, and I think this is something we have to keep in mind. Maybe the last point I want to raise is how to, I don't know if I have to say solve or manage, maybe both, how to solve or manage ethno-national conflicts. I think that here we find once again that more or less the two parameters I just mentioned when I spoke about what makes accommodation collapse. Those two parameters are, on the one side, the internal situation, and on the other side, the external involvement. First, internal situation, and here again I think that the Yugoslavia cases is quite interesting. At one time, it happens that the elites try to find a solution because the situation on the ground changed, and leads them to leave the path of war and build an agreement. So I mean, there is a rational choice in choosing to opt out of violence and to go to an agreement like a Dayton agreement, or for Yugoslavia, or in another way, of course, also the Oslo agreement, which was mentioned, even if the first was more successful than the second one. So the evolution of the situation on the ground is maybe even the most important factor which may lead people to try to end violence and to go in the direction of an agreement. And the second, which appears quite important in a lot of cases which were presented, is of course the external involvement. It is very dubious that, for instance, the Kosovo case could have been solved at least temporarily. I know there is no permanent settlement there, but at least temporarily, without external involvement, without the intervention, military intervention, and the peacekeeping forces, and all this institutional engineering which came in the process of what is wrongly, in my opinion, called nation building, but which is in fact state building. So the factor of external involvement seems to me very important in several of those cases, and mainly in protracted conflict. External involvement is, in my view, very often very beneficial in order to go in the direction of a solution. But, and here I will end with my remarks. The thing here, and we had several times this was raised in the discussions, you can manage ethno-national conflicts after the breakup of violence. It's much more difficult to really solve them on their roots. And this has something to do with the fact that to go towards reconciliation is a very, very long and risky and difficult task, I think. And of course, we know that precisely here in that region concerning the Israeli-Arab conflict. Let me just maybe add 2 or 3 words concerning this question of reconciliation. Because after the panel this morning, I thought that there were clearly 2 different outlooks on what should be done. I think you can have a settlement, or at least a management of this kind of nationalist conflict without a reconciliation. But if you really want to enter in a perspective of coexistence, you cannot do without reconciliation. But reconciliation cannot be built on amnesia. I think that a genuine reconciliation has to be based on the acknowledgement that wrongs were being done. It has to go with the revision of national myth. Otherwise, it will be always a very shaky shaky reconciliation. I'm thinking here of 2 examples, and I'm drawing them especially outside the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as such, even if, of course, I have that also in mind. I think that the wrong way to do reconciliation, or at least to try to do, is what they are doing in Lebanon. The solution they adopted there is quite simple. They just say, we try to forget what happened during the civil war. There is a general amnesty for everybody, and we just put this period under brackets. But I think this will not hold for a long time. The better example is an example which was raised here, even if it was maybe not in the same direction, and this example is South Africa. I think it's a much better example of reconciliation, reconciliation without revenge, but reconciliation based on the acknowledgement of some wrongs which were being done and the revision of national myth. But this perspective of reconciliation has not to come, I mean, immediately. It can come as a work in progress, I would say, after a settlement, even if it's an unsatisfactory settlement, as for instance the settlements in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is of course not very satisfactory as such, because the state has been kept as a unity, but in reality it's a divided state. But maybe it's a first step before a genuine reconciliation who might come afterwards. So I will stop there, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mark Beissinger, who spent 20 years teaching at University of Wisconsin and is currently this year at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. And from the fall of 2006, this year, will be moving to Princeton University. His field, as you know, is Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, especially the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet states, and we'll hear his perspective now.
Well, first let me also echo the thanks to Modi for inviting me and for organizing this conference, and also I want to thank all of you for enlightening me over the past few days. It's a daunting task to be charged with trying to make sense out of everything that you said. It kind of reminds me of what's known. It reminds me of what's known in physics as the field of string theory. Maybe some of you have heard of string theory. It's a relatively new and controversial field. It's charged with developing a theory of everything. And I spent last year at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is chock full of string theorists, and got to know a few string theorists on the tennis court. And in between tennis sets, I discovered that string theory seeks to develop a theory of all of the forces of physics based on the idea that particles hang together, tethered on a microscopic wiggling string. Now, some people speak of the promise of string theory, but I have to tell you that after 30 years of research, string theory has yet to find a single scientific discovery. And also, the mathematical calculations necessary for practicing string theory have grown extraordinarily complex. And in their attempt to discover unity out of everything, string theorists posit the existence of 11 dimensions and innumerable possible universes. Now, we've been charged with the task of trying to draw a wiggling string here across the innumerable universes and dimensions of national and ethnic conflict that we've probed over the last 3 days. And I'm convinced that the equivalent of string theory would be disastrous for the study of nationalism and ethnic conflict. As Hedva Ben Israel outlined at the beginning of the conference, nationalism is too varied a phenomenon to be captured by a single unified theory. It's materialized in very different parts of the world differently. Many of the parts of the world that this conference has addressed. In Africa, the arbitrary imposition of the frame of the nation state by colonialism creates a very different legacy for nationalism and ethnicity than, say, the issues involved in ethnic nationalism in former Yugoslavia, which are different from the issues of trying to integrate new Muslim minorities in Europe, or transcending the racial divides of Brazil, or the nationalisms that stand at the basis for efforts to project Russian or American power in the world today, or the issues of integration of new minorities in the new Europe. So, there are good grounds, I think, to think about our field as inevitably mired in a pluralism of perspectives by the very nature of the phenomena that we study. So rather than tie a wiggling string across this conference, I'm reduced to talking about themes, a somewhat incoherent collection of themes. And if there is a wiggling string that ties them together, it is how nationalism is evolving today, and the challenges that that poses for us as scholars and practitioners. So I'll try to bring in as many of you as I can into this, and to bring your ideas into this, but I apologize to those whom I've somehow overlooked. Now, as Hedva pointed out early on, if we delve back into the history of nationalism, we would see that, in fact, nationalism has always been a moving target. And Paul James raised these issues specifically with regard to globalization and its effects on nationalism and ethnic conflict, arguing that such conflicts today are intertwined with a series of, in his words, localizing, transnationalizing, and globalizing forces that did not operate on the same scale as in the past, and thereby altered the character of the forces that appropriate the ontology of nationalism and the ways in which nationalism works its way into the deadly realm of violence. Paul, in some ways, painted a picture of a frighteningly violent world, with millions dying from what he called transnational localized violence. He rooted contemporary violent conflicts not in the state itself or in the nature of nationalist or the ethnic or nationalist phenomenon, but in the linkages cutting across states and acting on them, seeing these as explaining, as he said, well, he used the expression 9/10 of what takes place in the field of ethnic conflict. Now here, while embracing his basic idea and many of the points that he has made, I'll have to throw out a few red flags, because for one thing we should realize that In most states, in spite of global change, majority and minority relations continue to be characterized by peaceful interaction. And indeed, in a number of places around the world, Northern Ireland, the Basque Lands, for instance, we've seen a distinct move away from violence, in part because of the effects of global change. So one of the problems with the study of national conflict, and this was also raised by Alain as well, and one of the problems in part in the way in which this conference has been structured, is the tendency for researchers to focus almost exclusively on cases in which conflict has occurred, rather than contemplating as well those in which it hasn't materialized or has diminished, the non-event or the different type of event. And I should say that it's not even clear, to me at least, that our age is characterized necessarily by more nationalist and ethnic conflict than, at least in the past, in the recent past of 50 to 100 years ago. Or at least this is a proposition I think that needs to be proved. What global change has done instead is to alter the nature of the playing fields on which the game of identity politics is played. And it's true that the resurgence of American nationalism in reaction to transnational terrorism, or the cartoon controversy over depictions of Islam and its effects on Muslim communities around the world, demonstrate that identity formation increasingly is linked with actions taking place in distant parts of the world, or connected with distant parts of the world, not just within the boundaries of the nation state. But the state, though embattled, still remains the primary arena of nationalist and ethnic politics, even in a globalizing world. And the fundamental stakes of nationalist politics, and this is something that I think often wasn't clarified exactly at this conference, what are the stakes involved in nationalist conflict? The territorial boundaries and membership communities of states, as well as the cultural rules underpinning them, these are enduring objects of politics that generate their own dynamics. As Alain said, nationalism involves the state, and the rules that states establish and the ways in which these empower or disempower cultural difference is the central narrative, the central object of nationalist politics. It's also true, as was said here at the conference, that we tend to over-label the ethnic, and that often identities are instrumentally manipulated. We often over-label the ethnic because we don't have an adequate vocabulary to describe many of the conflicts that we see. But I would not downplay the autonomy of national and ethnic identity in the production of contemporary conflict as much as Paul did, or as much as some others have done at this conference. Identities may never be a sufficient cause for conflict, but neither is elite mobilization, elite manipulation or globalization. We need to move away from simplistic notions of causation in the study of nationalism, and particularly the kind of straw manning of the ancient hatreds argument that unfortunately seemed to frame so much of the discussion at this conference, which is a hypothesis that really only journalists take seriously. It's not a hypothesis that scholars take seriously, or that practitioners take seriously. So we need instead to think about the variety of the role of history and the variety of ways and multiple causal paths involved in how nationalist conflict and violence are produced. Historical narratives, as we saw in the recent panel today, historical narratives matter. It's a fact that we know so well from the discussions earlier and from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And these are rooted in history, even if they are subject to change, even if they're subject to manipulation, and often get in our way in terms of resolving conflict. One of the central themes that this conference has pointed to, though, is the general erosion of the capacity and legitimacy of the nation-state. The nation-state being the fundamental object of nationalist politics. Now, this is due in part to globalization, but not entirely to globalization. The crisis of the nation-state, in fact, predates, to some extent, our current era of accelerated globalization. Though I think, as we've seen over and over again at this conference, globalization has put particular stress on states by accelerating the movement of peoples, resources, and ideas in ways that states find difficult to control, at the same time as empowering new actors and creating new channels of interaction. The crisis of the nation-state becomes plain when we reflect about how the theoretical tools that we possess to understand and manipulate ethnic conflict and identity have changed over time. And indeed, the crisis of the nation-state is also in some ways a crisis of our theoretical perspectives about nationalism. The image of Leviathan and of nationalism as its political religion loomed large in the field's origin back in the 1940s in response to the interwar experience, and particularly the Holocaust. By contrast, by the 1960s and 1970s, in the wake of decolonization and the wave of cultural mobilization that occurred within post-colonial and industrial states, nationalism and ethnic loyalties came to be understood as a powerful force challenging the coherence of the culturally plural state and its teleology of national integration. Now, it was at this time that the schools that we associate, some of the schools that we associate with the field, primordialism and instrumentalism, emerged as ways of trying to explain how ethnic identities resisted the integrative efforts of the state and undermined its coherence. It was also at this time, and very much connected with the emergence of those fields, that the political engineering of cultural accommodation became a significant field of inquiry. As social scientists looked to these models, these social science models, and practitioners looked to these social science models as ways of trying to organize state institutions as a way of mitigating conflict, either through the recognition of the stickiness of identities, which is what is the basis underlying the consociational model, of the givenness and stickiness of identities, or in recognition of how incentives and interests could be manipulated, what Benjamin Riley has called centripetalism, that is the design of institutions aimed at depoliticizing nationalist extremes through incentives, in other words, through the instrumentalist assumptions. Now, ironically, this recognition of the state and its institutions as perhaps the critical variable in conditioning nationalist conflict occurred precisely at the time when those institutions were themselves beginning to come under increased challenge and stress. Constructivism, which emerged out of instrumentalism, has increased our understanding of how identities come into being, but at the same time, its implications for the role of the state in nationalism are ambiguous. On the one hand, state policies and institutions and processes of socialization clearly play a significant role in the theory. But constructivism also pointed to national and transnational discourses, modular ways of behaving and acting and thinking about nationhood, the role of intellectuals and communication technologies, and even post-national modes of thinking that implied a shrinking role of the state as the master variable. Now, much of the problem with the primordialism, instrumentalism, and constructivism debate, and why it has, I think, in the opinion of many, grown relatively stale, is that none of these perspectives is capable of addressing all of the dimensions and situations raised by nationalism on their own. And when we talk about nationalist conflict and the ways that we have to influence its materialization and resolution, as has often been said at this conference, context makes all the difference. In some circumstances, the stickiness of identities and strong attachments to them may in fact be important elements of what we want to highlight and know, and how we explain and deal with ethnic phenomena. In the case of Belgium, as we saw, a consociational solution based on primordial assumptions of attachments to identities has reinforced divisions and moved Belgium toward a seemingly irresolvable crisis of statehood. By contrast, in the case of Dagestan, that we also heard about, where the number of cultural segments is much higher, or in the context of Bosnia or Northern Ireland, where external forces have provided a guarantee for the frame of the state, consociationalism may have worked fairly well, or at least done its job in holding the state together and avoiding conflict, although it may take its toll in terms of democratic practice. It may sometimes be the best that we can do. So no single recipe is going to work in all situations, and the question is, what is the context? And this is in some ways the question that hasn't really been addressed at this conference, or what wasn't addressed enough in this conference. What factors are important in determining the applicability of one approach or another to a particular situation? And unfortunately, as I said, we really needed to address that more. What globalization has meant, though, is an increased instability of, I would say, all of the institutional solutions we pursue with regard to resolving nationalist conflicts. That instability comes because things change rapidly on the ground. Demographically, it often changes. Economically, it changes. Politically, it changes. In some ways, change is difficult for institutions to adapt. Institutions never adapt as quickly as change. Astrid observed that the crisis of the Belgian consociational model accelerated in part due to the growing economic differentiation between linguistic communities due to economic change along the differences of communal lines. Here again we see sort of how change undermines our models. We place these models in institutions. The institutions can't adapt and move quickly enough to deal with these situations. In Dagestan, the consociational model that has, in fact, worked fairly well there to contain conflict, has been put under stress, as Moshe Gamer noted, by the intrusion of radical Islam into the region. Again, a global change, in some ways, that has put that model under stress. Now, instrumentalist solutions, likewise, have experienced difficulties adjusting to rapidly changing circumstances due to the transnational flow of ideas and capital and information. The Nigerian model of federalism, for instance, which Horowitz held out as a poster child for the federal engineering of moderation through incentives, has been placed under stress by the politicization of religion. As Islamic regions in the country, under the influence of global trends within the Islamic world, have adopted Sharia law as the basis of their civil codes, as companies have moved into the Nigerian Delta and developed a certain model of oil development there. So if the problem of consociationalism is that it reinforces differences, the problem of the instrumentalist approach has generally been how to interest elites in situations of division and conflict in participating in rules that empower moderation, and how to deal with rapid change in institutions that may not be relevant 5-10 years from now for what one puts on the ground today. We also talked about democracy. Democracy as a powerful means for resolving ethnic issues. Some people would say that democracy actually is a precondition for any kind of just solution of ethnic issues. But we didn't talk that much about democratization as a process of change. And democratization, by contrast, is generally held to be a factor fostering conflict. So we have a gap here between the institutions that we see as being useful for trying to resolve conflict and the paths by which we get to those institutions. So many of the traditional institutional answers that our field has developed to mitigate or manage conflict within the container of the state are under stress. They hold the potential in some cases to become actually the sources of conflict themselves. Now, lest we think that only the state is challenged in today's environment, the paper that we didn't hear, at least judging from its abstract by Jose Manuel Cejas, was to argue that in Spain, globalization has not only complicated the construction of a coherent nation-state, it's also made the building of a homogeneous sub-state Catalan nationalism or Basque nationalism more difficult as well. Because it's undermined state capacity at the local level, it's fostered in-migration and complicated the task of nation building. So, the point is that nation building, whether it be at the level of the state or the sub-state unit, has been made more difficult today. There's yet another reason why it's been made more difficult. The rise of international norms has complicated nation building in ways that didn't exist before. By and large, failed states no longer disappear by being swallowed by stronger states. And as has been noted over and over again at this conference, norms of state sovereignty have largely brought an end to interstate warfare, but have pushed violence into the container of the state. While we continue to live with a dominant sovereignty norm, sovereignty has at the same time become problematized today in ways that also make nation building more difficult. It's no longer unimaginable for states to break apart, as was true during the Cold War era, or even to be partitioned, as Dan Server's talk on Kosovo implied. Moreover, international norms of self-determination and minority rights have complicated nation building by creating an atmosphere in which states can no longer dispose of their populations as they wish without paying some kind of cost. The rise of the Hague Tribunal, the International Criminal Court, which has taken up the Ugandan, Congolese, and Sudanese cases, and various post-conflict tribunals elsewhere have meant that the most flagrant violations of minority rights no longer go entirely overlooked or unpunished, and that therefore international norms to some extent govern these relationships in a way that they did not in the past, even if they're only enforced after the fact. Now, in this sense, the rise of a global human rights regime limits the types of violent tools used for nation building that were once used in the past. Yet, at the same time, Jeffrey Lesser raised what I thought was an important issue. How do states hide racial and ethnic dominance? The use of citizenship citizenship prior to 1940 in Estonia and Latvia is a good example of how norms of self-determination for citizens of the interwar Latvian or Estonian Republic are used to, and we mentioned this in the last session, are used to in some ways cloak a kind of ethnic dominance. So it's clear today that norms of sovereignty and self-determination are used by states not just in empowering ways, but in disempowering ways. Ethno-federalism, for instance, as Yitzhak Brudny noted, in Russia, created the seeming form of sovereignty, but increasingly without its substance. At the same time, even the perversion of norms carries certain consequences today. So the faux ethno-federalism in the USSR, for instance, was a powerful factor in the consolidation of ethnic identities, and much of the mobilization involved in the Soviet collapse worked within the norms of the ethno-federal system, was structured by the ethno-federal system in subtle ways. So if norms carry with them consequences, then part of the struggle of contemporary nationalism is a struggle over norms. It's a struggle over how norms are manipulated and how norms are used. It's also the case today that, as opposed to the past, national and ethnic conflict is embedded in a thick network of global institutions and third-party actors. And this was effectively pointed to by Gali Golan's talk in her review of the repeated attempts by the international community to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. The contemporary politics of nationalism entail a significantly expanded role for external influence and third-party actors in determining the outcomes of nationalist conflicts. A number of these issues were raised, although Janusz Bugajski emphasized the failures of the EU to contain Yugoslav conflict. It's also clear that the EU and the process of EU expansion have had a profound effect on the nature of European nationalisms, of East European nationalisms, both within established Europe and beyond. Preet Yarve's paper, for instance, outlines the rise, at least the abstract does, not his presentation, outlines the rise of two very different forms of Baltic nationalism, a more conservative strand oriented towards prioritizing the interests of newly empowered dominant groups over minorities, taking the traditional ethnic nation state as its model, and viewing Russians and Russia as an imminent threat, and the other oriented towards transnational integration and the integration of minorities, embracing multiculturalism along with globalization. Now, he observes that external actors, in particular the EU and NATO, were critical in empowering that latter version over the former. Now, where our conference may have also fell short a bit was in specifying the conditions under which these external actors, these third-party actors, exercise effective influence on conflict and the conditions when they don't. And here, also, something which went unspoken was the larger geopolitical context and how that might make a difference. The transformation of the global order from a bipolar to a unipolar one has meant that the American state has become a central actor in the mitigation and the production of ethnic conflict around the world. Now, another way in which nationalism has been changing and which received considerable attention at this conference is the effect of what has been called the not at this conference but elsewhere, the desecularization of politics and the relationship between nationalism and religion that this implies. It's true that if we look back at the history of nationalism, religion played a very important role in the early formation of national identities from the 17th century to the 19th centuries. Adrian Hastings' work on the translation of sacred texts, or Anthony Marx's work on the role of the Reconquista in Spain point to the role of religion in early nationalism. And we also know the examples of Irish and Polish nationalisms that point to this. But in the course of the 20th century, that relationship between religion and nationalism grew weaker. Perhaps as secular trends destabilized the role of religion in society. And the vast majority of the elites who were carriers of nationalist ideology were, in fact, specifically secular in character. But toward the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st centuries, we've seen, as we saw at this conference, a new role emerge for religion in nationalist conflict. Indian nationalism came to be primarily expressed as a religious nationalism. American and Israeli nationalisms have also grown increasingly religious in character. Persian and Arab nationalisms, once secular in character, have grown intertwined with religion. And so we have witnessed, in some ways, a recomposition of religion and nationalism that wasn't present earlier or that harks back to an earlier period in the history of nationalism. Margarita Asenova focused on the way in which political Islam has penetrated Central Asia and has become the major vector of opposition to secular authoritarian Central Asian regimes. What our theories are ill-equipped to do is to explain why these syntheses between religion and nationalism occurred and how the increasing fusion of religion with nationalism alters the chemistry of the nationalist phenomenon. Does it make identities more brittle, less amenable to instrumentalist manipulation, more extreme, more prone to the production of violence? And once mobilized, can religio-nationalist movements be easily demobilized? And we've spoken at this conference about the expansion of immigration in the global centers of the world economy and the new cultural issues that has fostered. In highly secular Europe, which has defied the trends toward the resurgence of religious belief elsewhere in the world, the immigration issue has, as Riva Castellano observed, returned the issue of religion back to the public agenda, has challenged the boundaries between the public and the private. Dominant European nations see the growing visibility of Islam within their spheres, within their public spheres, and the conflict between traditional Islamic social mores and the individualism of liberal democracy as challenges to a liberal national order. The United States, similarly, is confronting a major issue with the acceleration of immigration across its Mexican border, to the point that the U.S. Senate has voted to declare English the official language of the country. And the U.S. military is now deployed on the Mexican border. And we also are constructing our own security fence. So here, global migration has not only created, in some cases, new ethnic underclasses, but it's also fostered a series of reactive nationalisms as well among dominant groups within receiving societies. While in the 1990s, multiculturalism was viewed as the solution to these issues, increasingly multiculturalism is under assault, as dominant majorities have fallen back on policies of assimilation as the solution to the new pluralism created by the global migration. Finally, let me end by noting that in the realm of identity politics in general, we live in a world, as Robert Cooper suggests, in which the modern, postmodern, and pre-modern overlap and intertwine. And in some realms, the pre-national forms of identity, like clan, or as Moshe Gammer described it in Dagestan, the Jamats, or as we heard about in some ways, the construction of a Berber identity over and above a local community identity. Sometimes this engages with the ethnic and the national, while in other realms, the national engages with the transnational, as in the gropings toward a European identity or the emergence of a Muslim identity, say in France. So we live in a period in which, a kind of distemporal period, in which we see all these different issues, not only from the past and from the past history of nationalism, but also new issues that have emerged onto the agenda, which means that the types of situations that we're dealing with are much more pluralistic than we were dealing with in the past. Okay, let me just conclude by saying that string theory will not work in dealing with ethnicity and nationalism. We need theories, I think, that build from the ground up. I found the most interesting part of this conference being precisely those case studies that dealt with specific cases, that build from the ground up, that also recognize the continuing role of the state as the critical site of nationalism and as the critical actor of nationalism, but also that identify the critical variables of that very slippery word context. I once was at a conference where someone used the word context, and a well-known scholar, David Layton, got up and said, "You just told me nothing." The word context is basically a word that means everything. And so what we need to do is to identify elements of context and not talk about context in a generic way, but identify the specific elements of context, working within that kind of middle range, rather than debate primordialism, instrumentalism, constructivism, and to deal with new syntheses, the new syntheses that might emerge out of that. And I think that's exactly where both the scholarly analysis of nationalism as well as the practical side of nationalism needs to move. Thank you.
Well, we've heard two concluding papers, and now someone has come forward to summarize not only the conference but the concluding papers as well. And that is Rajan Menon, who teaches at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And he has been in the past an academic fellow and senior advisor at the Carnegie Corporation in New York, developing the corporation's Russia initiative. He's been a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, taught at Columbia and at Vanderbilt, and his next book, The End of Alliances, will be published this year by Oxford University Press. The last word.
I'm going to try very hard to stay in the time limit. All of you look like you've been fighting an ethnic war and have this dull, gray look of pain all over your face. I'd like... What was that?
People look joyous.
Look joyous. Okay, well, we'll go with that. Yeah, we'll go with that. That's a good theory. I want to thank Moti and Tamar. I guess Moti's not here. In particular for inviting me to this conference. I was actually asked to write a paper. I pulled out, and then I begged Moti to let me back in some capacity. And here I am as the discussant of the discussants. I've never done that before, don't know how to go about it. So I'm going to do some of the things that the previous two speakers did. We just sort of pull out some themes that were discussed in the conference, but I think more broadly speak to the state of the field. And there will be some overlap with Mark. I promise I didn't steal his notes. And so I want to begin with two areas where I actually disagree with him. I'm not a big believer that norms have inhibited ethnic conflict and violence. I just am not. If you look at cases like Rwanda or Sudan or Cambodia or East Timor or Yugoslavia, I don't think when murderous people set about killing people and raping women, they're particularly concerned about norms. I just don't. It depends on a certain level of development of a state. If it's not developed and integrated in the global economy, I don't think norms matter at all. Dagestan, I don't know what Moshe would say about it if he were here, but I don't think it's a successful case of consociational democracy. First, there's no institution. consociationalism. Okay, there's no institutional mechanism for it, and Dagestan is the second most violent place in the Soviet Union. It's hard in Russia. Now, having said that, let me start with a theme that I am in full accord with, a theme that Mark suggested. I go away from this conference, as I have from others, skeptical about meta-theories of nationalism, this attempt to see nationalism as a trans-historical phenomenon that needs to be explained, and then to apply these grand theories onto specific cases. I think that those attempts lead us into a dead end. If the goal is, and it should be, to come up with certain empirically verifiable, testable, I mean you have to know when something is said is wrong, propositions that are useful to scholars and potentially to policymakers. Now, why do I think it's a dead end? Invariably, these meta-theories begin by telling us that the locus of national conflict or religious conflict is not in the state, but that other levels of analyses have to be taken into account. The region, and then, of course, is now currently fashionable, globalization. The problem is this. The cure is worse than the disease itself. Because by the time you download explanatory factors from each level of analysis, what you've done is to create this witch's brew, this big cauldron in which you throw everything and stir it up, and you've engaged in conceptual profligacy and empirical barefootedness. You've developed essentially a theory of everything. That everything more or less matters. Because without causal linkages being specified and without relative emphasis, what you have is not a theory, you have a laundry list of things. And I'm not saying everybody who works in this vein does that, but that's certainly a danger in these approaches, and I know of several who fall victim to this. So one other thing about globalization. It's one thing to say that external factors matter in ethnic conflict, and who would disagree with that? The fact that nobody responded to Rwanda or that the Tutsi army was in Uganda mattered to the outcome of the conflict in Rwanda. That is not, however, the same thing as claiming that globalization as such drives ethnic conflict. I'm very skeptical of this argument because it's often suggested and asserted rather than empirically demonstrated, or at least I haven't seen good empirical demonstrations. The other problem is that in arguing that the central focus of ethnic conflict is not within the state, these meta-theories go overboard and make domestic issues, societal differences, the role of the state seem unimportant. I would argue that it still remains a central focus. So that's one point. The second point has to do with modalities of nationalism. Now here I feel like I'm watching the tail wag the dog one more time, or the dog chase its tail one more time. We're still debating this business of whether it's ethno-nationalism or primordialism that matters, whether Anthony Smith was right, whether it's instrumentalism, elites mobilizing nationalism to make people do wicked things, whether it's constructivism, this endless packaging, repackaging of nationalism, whether it's Gellner's theory, modernization creates modern nationalism. I mean, for goodness sake, if we can't get beyond this, and a group of policymakers gets us in a room and says, tell me 5 things that you know about nationalism. If we recycle this stuff over and over again, my undergraduates do this. And, we should get sort of beyond this. As Mark mentioned, I think it really depends on context. And with due respect to David Leighton, he's epitomizes one of these people that strips social theory of context. So, Anthony Smith is surely right in making the point that even though Slobodan Milosevic may have spun the Battle of Kulikovo, in other words, it was not a case of a Christian Serbian king fighting the evil Ottoman Empire, we know that the Ottomans recruited to their ranks other Serbian Orthodox princes who didn't like Prince Lazar. But he wouldn't have been able to invoke that imagery or that symbol unless the Battle of Kulikovo-Polje had happened and unless it had some resonance to the average Yugoslav. Likewise, it's pretty clear that without the telephone, the telegraph, modern educational systems, print capitalism, as Anderson calls it, you wouldn't have modern nationalism. So the point is not whether this is right or that is right. It depends on what, I'll forget context for a moment. It depends on what you're trying to explain. It is entirely a question of what is your research question, because different conceptions of nationalism are useful for answering certain questions and others not. Gellner is relatively not useful, I would argue, for explaining the dynamics of the Yugoslav conflict, why the violence began. I would say Anderson, or the elite mobilization theory, is more useful. So we should get beyond this, it seems to me. Point 3, the paradox of design. What I found interesting in Astrid's paper, and also in some others, is that there is an interesting phenomenon that goes on. In an effort to accommodate and reconcile and provide representation to people who are dissimilar, you can come up with designs, be it consociational democracy or federalism in the Yugoslav case, that really reinforce differences and make politics much more contentious. Astrid told me, I think on the bus, that she thinks the Belgian concept of Belgium as a nation state is over, which clearly means that the design of the Belgian political system has made the differences between Walloons and the Flemings so entrenched that they see each other as unable to live in harmony. In Dagestan, I think it's clearly a case of consociationalism coming apart, because day after day. What? Well, you talked to Astrid about that. I'm just reporting what she told me. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you left, and so this is my time. So hang on. So you have the paradox of design. The Soviet Union fell into 15 ethnic fragments, and it did so fairly bloodlessly, because the Soviet system was composed of 15 federal units. Two other puzzles from two cases. One is Yugoslavia. I still don't have a good answer to the following question. Yes, there was a trans-ethnic, transnational Yugoslav conception. And yes, there was intermarriage and cosmopolitan cities, and people lived in harmony. But why was it that within 2 years, maybe fewer than that, people were raping and killing each other, slaughtering one another? There was this descent into hell. And I've thought about this because I remember Richard Kaplan said that these were very thick bonds that existed in Yugoslavia. How is it then that these thick bonds just came apart? And I'll take up a point that Mark alerted me to in a conversation we had. It's just that when the violence starts, when you're not debating any longer how many seats in Parliament and who gets what share of the budget, but when you start killing one another, these bonds come apart very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. Richard mentioned the possibility of a race war in New York. I don't know how likely it is, but the bonds there are even thinner. The linkages between Hispanics and blacks, Hispanics and whites and blacks are paper thin in a city like New York, right? So you have to ask yourself, if violence began there, how quickly would the whole thing come apart? I want to say a word about India, because too bad that the young woman who spoke yesterday about India is not here. On the one hand, the Hindu-Muslim business is a sorry business. There have been serial attacks by Hindus on Muslims. The BJP is completely culpable in its chauvinistic, religion-baiting stereotyping of Muslims. These cases need to be documented as a matter of empirical social science. They should be condemned as a moral matter. But it's one thing to go from that assessment to argue, as she did, that Hindu-Muslim antagonism is the greatest threat to Indian democracy. I think that's simply an unsustainable thesis, right? I know of not one instance, where Indian democracy was ever threatened by brutal Hindu upon Muslim violence. The gravest threat to Indian democracy was something that had nothing to do with Hindu-Muslim relations. It was Mrs. Gandhi's declaration of the state of emergency in 1975. Suspension of civil liberties, the attempt to create an authoritarian system, undoing decades of Indian democracy. Nothing to do with Muslims and Hindus. The second major threat was the rising tension and ultimately a civil war, the violence between Sikhs and Hindus, who had gotten together for generations extraordinarily well. Nothing to do with Muslims, because Sikhs and Hindus both, in large measure, sort of have difficult relationships with Muslims. So the thing that needs to be explained is not so much how Hindu-Muslim relations are threatening Indian democracy and why is that happening, but to use a metaphor I think that you used, why didn't the dog bark? In other words, why is it that after year upon year of systematic violence in this country, 130 million Muslims, larger than Pakistan, right, in a Hindu-majority country, how is it that Indian democracy has survived? There's a stable state. Elections have been held at the central and regional and provincial and district level to transfer power year after year. There is a free press, there is civil society. Why is it that these religious clashes have not led to the death of democracy? Now, I have my own explanation, which I won't inflict on you, but it seems to me documenting one thing, that is systematic violence between two national communities, and concluding that this is a grave risk to a state, is sometimes appropriate. In this case, it's not appropriate. It misses entirely the question that really needs to be answered, which is why, despite this, hasn't the state come unhinged or unglued? So, thank you. I don't know how many minutes I took, but thanks. All right.
The last word, in fact, was thanks, which is very good. Well, thank you very much. Moti, do you have any last words of Nigila? Or?
It was nice having you. The conference is closed.
I'll give you my card too.
To the States.
Great.
This is not my Lehigh card. This is two numbers. A lot of emails.
We're actually in Washington law. Yeah. Because my in-laws.
My wife is a humanist, so you can actually talk to her.
Yeah, this is funny. I never hear this kind of stuff. This is another language.
I'm sure you'll get it well.
And I like what you said, that the level of generalization in the model is something that we don't do. I mean,
The ultimate irony of positions on engineering is the effect what you're all doing is developing are different. One of your and you're right. Logical instruction goes.
I have to go to a wedding. Okay. We'll be in touch. I'm glad that you're glad.
We should talk about other languages.
Okay.
I think the best we can do
Nice to see you.
without seeming track
Very interesting.
is what I was
saying. We never hear this stuff. It's political science is
Which is
number
why
one.
the Belgium
You know, what level of trying to find some way of all this together. We never